this meeting. Now my great pleasure is to introduce Dr. Kirk Savage. Kirk, I'll call him Kirk because I've known him for years now. It feels strange to call him Dr. Savage, but he's professor of history of art and architecture at the University of Pittsburgh, was the chair there for a number of years. He's written 2 award-winning books, Standing Soldiers, Kneeling Slaves, Race, War, and Monument in the 19th Century, and Monument Wars, Washington, D.C., the National Mall, and the Transformation of the Memorial Landscape. This is another book that I've read, the Monument Wars, which I just found an incredibly interesting history of monuments in the U.S. And the other things that I could add, I had on my list a number of new projects that Kirk is working on. And but that's part of what I left in that.
One of them
I
is
think
right here.
Kirk will be telling us about those anyhow. The other thing is that I've actually had a number of conversations with Kirk over the years about art history. I'm a philosopher, but I've been doing some work in philosophy of aesthetics, and I found his comments to be just extremely helpful to my work, as well as his book being extremely helpful to it. So I want to thank him for that. And he's also just one hell of a nice guy. So with that.
Thank you. So, well, it's nice to see some familiar old faces I haven't seen in quite a while here, and such a diverse group also. So I'm really interested in hearing your feedback on this from different perspectives. I have been thinking about this material for a while, but this particular version of it is pretty new, and I was going to try to keep it to 30 minutes, but I'm afraid it's going to probably bleed into 40 or so. This began really as the project began as a history of war memorials in the United States, so what I was calling a pacifist history of war memorials in the United States. And I began that, I actually wrote an introductory chapter for that book in which I plan to use this photograph to set it up. I plan to spend about maybe 2 paragraphs on this photograph, and this photograph ended up occupying my thinking and sort of taking over that entire chapter, and I've been thinking about it hard ever since. So what I'm going to try to do here is actually kind of reconnect it to the issue of monuments, but as you'll see, even in this talk, it's hard for me to get away from this photograph, and it actually occupies about probably 2/3 of the paper. So if there is one point that I think you will come away with from my talk today, it is that laying the war dead to rest was almost impossible. The dead were restless bodies that circulated physically, spiritually, and ideologically in a society that struggled to solve the predicaments they created. I'll be paying particularly close attention to the most restless bodies of all, the so-called unknown dead, which were what we would call unidentified, who became a cultural crisis during the war. The unknown dead were problematic and terrifying because they reveal just how quickly and utterly personal identity disintegrated when the physical body became disconnected from its name. And I'll attempt to argue that the search for solutions to this predicament fueled a new art and system of commemoration. And that's going to be the sketchy part that I'm going to want a lot of be interested in hearing from you about. So the photograph, and we can go to the next slide. The photograph in question here is one that Alexander Gardner took and copyrighted under the title "A Contrast, Federal Buried, Rebel Unburied, Where They Fell at the Battle of Antietam." And I'll be referring to it as contrast as I go along. It's one of several dozen photographs that Gardner and his assistant James Gibson took on September 19, 1862, in the beautiful, gently rolling farmland of central Maryland, 2 days after the horrific Battle at Antietam Creek, which was the single deadliest day of combat in the Civil War. The usual estimate is between 6,000 and 6,500 dead, which is more than double the number killed on September 11, 2001, and more than the total U.S. combat dead in all the other American wars in the 19th century combined in this one day. The losses at Gettysburg the following year would overtop Antietam, but the combat at Gettysburg was spread out over 3 days. The scale and concentration of losses at Antietam stunned everyone. One Confederate soldier, for example, described this scene in the immediate aftermath. Quote, "It is no figure of speech, metaphor, or anything but a simple fact to say that there were frequently places where for 50 or 60 yards you could step from one dead Yank to another and walk all over the ground without once touching it with your foot." Unquote. Antietam was an exceptional event in American history, and Gardner's photographs were exceptional for another reason, because they were the first photos ever made in the United States to depict corpses on a battlefield. And they were among the first in the world, actually. The single exception being a few little-known photographs taken 2 years earlier of Chinese corpses in Peking killed by the British in the Second Opium War. Gardner was with the Union Army during the Maryland campaign, probably working for the chief Union spy at the time, Alan Pinkerton. So he was at the battle on September 17th, but he didn't get to work until September 19th, after the Confederate Army had retreated and the Union commander, George McClellan, decided it was safe enough to begin burying the dead. And you can go to the, actually 2 slides. Gardner worked as quickly as he could, first trying to photograph bodies that the burial teams had not yet reached. Bodies that had lain untouched, decomposing for almost 48 hours. But rather quickly, the burial teams caught up with him, and by necessity, he began to document the process of burial. So we can go to the next one. And this is one Union burial team. The burial teams were Union soldiers themselves who had to bury their own dead and the enemy dead. And the next one, a very, very famous photograph that he copyrighted as Confederate dead gathered for burial. Is there any way to kill the top light here but leave the spotlights? Is that possible, or are they all on one switch? Huh. That's good. Right, thanks. As shocking as many of these photographs are, and we have to imagine them as even more shocking in 1862 because they were so unprecedented, even so, they are not as gruesome as they might have been, partly because of the camera technology, which was, of course, black and white, and long shutter times that ruled out action shots such as dragging bodies or dumping them in ditches. Partly because the Union Army was already clearing most of the worst scenes of death on the battlefield. Partly because Gardner, with a few exceptions like contrast, chose not to take close-ups of the dead. When one reads soldiers' accounts of the corpses on the battlefield, one realizes that Gardner had to make many quick, difficult decisions about what he should or should not show. And you have to remember that this was, the process of taking just one shot was very complex and elaborate. It would take 15 or 20 minutes minimum to set this up. And these were all done, they had to be developed as glass plate negatives on the spot. So it's not like just going around with a camera taking snapshots. So consider this soldier's account, for example. A soldier who described the shattered landscape, the trees splintered and torn, the houses riddled, the ground covered with crackers and canteens and haversacks and thousands of bullets and shells and swords. Then he goes on to say, quote, "But I can only see and think about those dead bodies. They are greatly swollen and fearfully distorted, some scarcely looking like human beings. Black blood and putrid matter are still oozing from the wounds in their heads, breasts, and sides." He ends by writing, "I am sick of the sight, which still haunts me and causes a chill to pass over my frame." Now, contrast stands out for a number of reasons. Now we can go to the next one here. It seems, and this actually, what I'm showing you is a print taken from the original glass plate negative, or it's actually a scan of the glass plate negative, which kind of miraculously survives at the Library of Congress. It seems to combine in one picture the two basic types of image Gardner was taking that day: the raw carnage of the battlefield on the one hand, and the cleanup work of the burial crews on the other hand. If we are to believe his title, we are looking at a corpse that curled up and died on this very spot, quote, "where they fell." right next to a corpse that has now been dropped in a freshly dug grave. So two bodies where they fell, one visible and the other no longer visible. And there is a third body in the foreground, a living body, who looks very much like a soldier from a burial team, perhaps the very man who dug the grave. Ignoring the corpse barely 6 feet away from him, he directs our attention instead to the grave's headboard. And we go to the next one. And if we put the headboard under magnification, something magical happens. A name appears. J.A. Clark, 7th Mich, Michigan. It's the only example I know of in all of Civil War battlefield photography of a readable name on a headboard on a grave. What we have here then is a body without a name and a name without a body. The Union soldier Clark has gained an identity but has lost his face. He is now a mere name without the uniquely physical residue of his likeness, his personality, and character. We can go on to the next one. The Confederate soldier loses his identity and becomes no man, or every man, but in his full material presence, with his face turned toward us, he retains a powerful hold on our sight and on our emotions. It is a puzzling and paradoxical composition, difficult to account for. A writer for Harper's Weekly, who described some of Gardner's photographs just a few weeks later, was clearly flummoxed by this one. It had, quote, a poetic and melancholy interest, he said, and there is such a dash of sentiment in it that it looks more like an artistic composition than the reproduction of an actuality, unquote. Something was wrong here, in other words. The photograph looked too much like a work of the imagination, too much like what an artist might compose for sentimental effect, and not enough like an actual situation that the photographer had stumbled upon. And we do have to remember that documentary photography as such didn't really exist. That term didn't exist, and this was very much the beginnings of that. Before it had hardly been something that, with rules and so on that we know nowadays. So in the interest of time, let me cut to the chase and say that I'm 99% sure that neither of the two men depicted here died on this spot. The Union soldier was buried here under this large tree because it was a good landmark for anyone coming to retrieve the body and rebury it. The Confederate soldier was moved here probably at Gardner's direction to make an interesting photograph. Now, this may sound shocking, but we know for a fact that Gardner moved bodies on the Gettysburg battlefield in 1863, and we have to remember that he spent the whole day at Antietam in the midst of the worst carnage in American history and the largest mass burial operation the nation had ever undertaken. And you can go to the next slide. And this is documented in a print in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. It's obviously much cleaned up. It shows them as very organized and effective, but it gives you the whole kind of sense of the burial operation, including dragging bodies to lines, digging trenches, dragging bodies into the trenches, filling the trenches, etc. All day long, he watched Union burial teams hoist and drag dead bodies all over the battlefield. What would it matter if he just borrowed one of them for a few minutes to make an interesting composition? And to go to the next one. If we look closely at the background of contrast, you'll see it over here on the far left. We can see a burial team and a line of dead bodies stretching across the open field. Perhaps the corpse in the foreground was on his way to or from that line of bodies, paused here for a moment before being dropped into a trench and mass grave. By claiming that these two bodies lay, quote, where they fell, unquote, Gardner was drawing attention to the reality that Union forces buried their own dead first, as best they could, and only then took care of the enemy dead, hastily dumping them into mass graves. But he was doing more than just making that simple point, I think. Obviously, he was working quickly and improvising on the fly, but it seems clear that he saw some larger allegorical potential in the juxtaposition of corpse and grave, something that spoke to the paradoxes of the situation he was witnessing, the large existential issues he and many others had to face that day. It is tempting to moralize the image, as images of death often are. If we wanted to pair Gardner's image with a moralizing text, an excellent choice would be Henry Ward Beecher's Thanksgiving sermon of 1863. We know that Gardner was strongly anti-slavery, and Beecher was one of the most famous and eloquent anti-slavery crusaders in the United States. In his brilliant sermon, Beecher makes a remarkable claim about the Confederate dead. He says that no matter how brave the Confederate soldiers were in combat, theirs would be, quote, a death utterly dead. They die indeed who die for slavery, unquote. Beecher then contrasts their fate with that of the Union dead. They that die for a good cause are redeemed from death. Their names are gathered and garnered, unquote. So I think you see where I'm going. The Union soldier's name has indeed been gathered and garnered, while the Confederate soldier has lost his name and is on the way to oblivion. The title Gardner chose and copyrighted would seem to lead part way toward this moralizing interpretation. Of the 120 photographs he took in the days following the battle, you can give the next one. This is one of only 17 he chose to copyright with the title. This is actually from the original copyright, handwritten copyright records in Washington, D.C. In the original copyright, he used the word rebel for the unburied soldier. A year later, when he sold the work through his own catalog, he changed the label to Confederate. Perhaps he was having second thoughts. In any case, he did not push this moralizing interpretation. He chose not to put contrast into his photographic sketchbook of the war, the next one, which is this very, very famous book that he published in 1866 with original prints of his photographs. And it was full of moralizing interpretations, which he wrote to accompany the photographs. In the next slide. And the photograph itself actually doesn't solicit this kind of moralizing interpretation, in my view. Even though the standing figure tries to divert our attention toward the Union grave and its headboard, it is hard not to keep coming back to the dead man's face and its uncanny presence. It is hard not to see in his gently curled, childlike pose a man who has passed beyond all violence and aggression. It is hard not to identify with him as a brother or son or lover or friend, one of many whose loss left some home or some heart bereft. And that is exactly how the writer from Harper's saw him. Harper's Weekly that I was telling you about. He saw him as a Union soldier, not a rebel. The writer no doubt saw the photograph without any title attached to it, and he came to the conclusion that I think the photograph invites. And that's a whole other subject that I can't get into, the relationship of titles or captions to photographs and how they help us read the images. But we maybe can talk about that a little bit more afterwards. There's much more we could visually explore in this image, which I think reinforces this point. But in order to push ahead with my own theme, I want to summarize where we have gotten so far. And I think I have another, maybe not. What's the, no, I can stick to that back with the other one. Yeah. Gardner deliberately arranged his composition to show us a body without a name and a name without a body. He had the audacity to display the two basic constituents of human identity right next to one another, within the same frame, and leave them unmatched, fragments that don't become a whole. With that one brilliantly simple move, he created a whole cascade of predicaments and perplexities about the dead, their identity, and their presence in the hereafter. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment and say a few words about religion, especially since I'm at a religious institution, but I would have said it anyway. Some historians have argued that religion, specifically Christianity, and now you get to the new slide, and specifically the doctrine of resurrection, which I show you illustrated very remarkably in this wonderful tomb in Westminster Abbey. They've argued that the doctrine of resurrection gave Americans a framework for coming to terms with wartime death. Some have even suggested that this is why 19th century Americans could tolerate and support a war that caused death on this unprecedented scale. Now, of course, the promise of resurrection was a great consolation to the soldiers themselves and their loved ones. Certainly wouldn't argue with that. What I want to emphasize, though, is that resurrection was not enough. It left very important questions unanswered and very important needs unmet. For example, where did the soul go after death? Did it stay with the body until resurrection day? Or did it go immediately to heaven or hell, or to some transitional zone like purgatory? Did it matter if the dead body was intact or not? Why did the dead body need a decent Christian burial, and what did that mean? The promise of eventual resurrection did not eliminate the fundamental human uncertainty about how and where the personal identity of the dead continued after death, and it didn't eliminate the fundamental human need of the living to stay connected with the dead here on earth. Or, as one man writing for the Methodist Quarterly in 1872 summed up the dilemma, quote, "Alas, we are still in the body," unquote. Even though he was arguing that personal identity did not reside in the actual physical particles of the body, which, science had shown that the particles of the body changed, constantly over time, even when you're alive. So even though he was arguing that, he had to concede that the grave is the chief earthly link which connects us with the departed, and we cannot but respect it. So between death and final resurrection at the end of time was a theological and practical vacuum, which had to be filled not just by respect, but by ritual and folklore, and perhaps even magic. This is why the extraordinary circumstances of death at places like Antietam created special predicaments that Christianity alone could not solve. So let's look at the predicament of identity. Most soldiers were terrified, and we can go to the next slide. We'll just keep it blank for a little while. Most soldiers were terrified of losing their identity after death. There was no dog tag system at the time, and soldiers went to great lengths to try to ensure that their name would stay connected to their body, pinning notices inside their little notes inside their uniform, or carrying small inscribed Bibles or photographs in a protected pocket. They knew how easily the dead lost their names. If the enemy took control of the battlefield, he often stripped soldiers of their valuables and even their clothes. And so did civilian scavengers who flocked to the battlefield afterwards. While there are no reliable statistics, it is generally assumed that nearly 50% of battlefield dead went unidentified, or in the language of the period became, quote, unknown. So let's consider the case of Alan Zacharias, who was in the same Michigan regiment as John Clark, 7th Michigan. The John Clark, the name in the photograph contrast. Zacharias carried a notebook in his pocket in which he wrote a one-paragraph autobiography. And then he followed it with this announcement. "Friend, if you find my body lifeless upon the field, bury it decently, mark its resting place, and inform my friends in the regiment and my father. Do this, and you shall be liberally rewarded and have the gratitude of my friends." So he's even obviously offering money if someone will just mark his grave. Again, if we look at this from a purely Christian standpoint, it should not matter where or how he is buried, or even if his grave is marked, because of course God knows where his grave is, and he will be resurrected if he deserves it. And yet all this mattered vitally to him and to his family. Without a name to mark his grave, his physical identity on earth was annihilated, and he was swallowed up by the ground, dust returning to dust. Zacharias was severely wounded at Antietam, it turns out, and as he lay on the battlefield, he wrote one last set of lines, a letter addressed to his father in Monroe, Michigan, telling him that he is dying, that he has done his duty, and hopes to meet his family again. And this is hard to read. Quote, "I am getting weak, my arms are free, but my chest all is numb. The enemy trotting over me, the numbness up to my heart. Goodbye all, your son, Alan," unquote. The coda to this story is that he and his letter were found and rescued on the battlefield, though he died of his wounds a few weeks later in a nearby Army hospital. So go to the next slide. So John Clark, who is in our photograph. John Clark, on the other hand, like most soldiers, did not get to say goodbye from the battlefield. But he was one of the lucky few to receive an individual burial in a marked grave. There were so many dead piled on the battlefield that Union burial teams had to bury not only the Confederates, but even many of their own dead in mass graves, especially those, of course, who had lost identifying information. If we look more closely at this headboard, we see that the name is carved by hand into a thin wooden board, which is probably the top of a cracker box that soldiers used for their rations. It looks like the three large capital letters in the top line were carved more deeply at first, and more deeply, with special care. And in the time remaining, the soldier carver added the rest of the last name with quicker and more shallow incisions. As soon as we pay attention to all this, we realize that this grave, is not the body's permanent resting place. It was never designed to be the body's permanent resting place. That this makeshift headboard is merely a temporary expedient. It is placed there to mimic a cemetery gravesite, and even the lettering on the board mimics the stone carver's art. But its primary purpose is to mark the grave just long enough so that the body can be identified and reburied elsewhere. The headboard is what enabled his family to find him, but it also enables us viewing the photograph to track him and his body. And sure enough, the name does match to an actual person, Lieutenant John Clark, Company D, 7th Michigan, a farmer's son from Monroe, Michigan, who volunteered for the Union Army in the summer of 1861. His officer status is significant because in death as in life, the bodies of officers were treated with more respect, and they were more likely to be in marked graves. When William Frassinito did the pioneering study of Gardner's Antietam photographs, he was most concerned to find a photograph of Clark and Clark's face, to attach a face to the name on the headboard. He wanted, in other words, to fill the absence that Gardner's composition had deliberately created, the void made by the dirt covering Clark's body. Amazingly, he succeeded. His quest, though, was the opposite of the quest made by Clark's family. They had a photograph of him already, this photograph. What they wanted and needed was his body. And because his grave was attached to a name, they were able to get it, to exhume the body inside the grave and have it returned to Monroe, Michigan, next slide, where he was reinterred in the family's plot in the local municipal cemetery. And this is pretty clearly a replacement headstone. I don't think this is a 19th century headstone, probably one that was created in the 20th century to replace one that had probably eroded. So why did the family do this? Part of the answer is that at this point in the war, there was no national cemetery system. Neither the federal government nor the federal army were officially responsible for taking care of the remains of the dead. The bodies at Antietam were buried on private land, often in fields that farmers needed to plow. So even when a body was buried with a headboard, there was no guarantee that body and name would stay connected for long. A soldier writing in the Philadelphia Inquirer toward the end of the war on a visit to the battlefield of Cold Harbor, Virginia, relates, quote, picking up a little headboard, which in dim letters bore the name of Corporal Lawrence Schuster, 82nd Pennsylvania Regiment, unquote. He found this stray board near the remains of over a dozen human skeletons which lay scattered above ground. So the only way a family could ensure that this didn't happen, that the name stayed with the body, was to retrieve the remains and have them reburied in a proper cemetery if they had the resources to do so. But there was probably another reason the family made this quest for their son's body, and that was to keep his body near their own. Alas, we are in the body. It's the quote from the Methodist scholar. The Clarks knew and loved their son through his body, and to have his body near theirs allowed them to maintain that connection. Even if they could no longer see his body, they could stand in its presence. It is at this very moment that the responsibility, this very moment, historical moment, that the responsibility for the war dead and their ideological affiliations began to shift, with the nation state by necessity poised to take a much more active role. Henry Ward Beecher, in his 1863 Thanksgiving sermon, was among the first to redefine and expand the war dead's agency. I'll quote from him. This is that same sermon in which he makes the moralizing interpretation about the Confederates. Quote, "Are they dead that yet act? Are they dead that yet move upon society and inspire the people with nobler motives and more heroic patriotism? Ye that mourn, let gladness mingle with your tears. He was your son, but now he is the nation's." Beecher circulated the dead body rhetorically from the family to the nation, but Clark's family wasn't buying it. They circulated the actual body in the opposite direction, even though they appear to have been staunchly pro-Union in a staunchly Union state. Interestingly, this little headstone they erected for their son was the only monumental recognition Clark got. There was no Union soldier built in Monroe, Union soldier monument built in Monroe, Michigan, either in the cemetery or in the town, until just last year, 2012, as part of the sesquicentennial. Okay, so it's a point I'll return to very briefly at the end. So that was the fate of the body lying unseen in the grave in Gardner's photograph. We can go to the next one. So now let's turn to the other dead body, the rebel soldier, and its fate. Here we have the exact reverse of the problem faced by Frostenito. We have a face but no name. And this is a very different kind of problem. We know that somewhere outside the frame of the photograph there were people just like Clark's family who knew his face and could identify him. His name is no doubt recorded somewhere, maybe even on a monument. But there is no longer any way to connect him to any of those artifacts of his existence on Earth. If we stay within the frame of the photograph, he is a fully present body, and indeed perpetually present. But without a name, without that one simple bit of metadata, this magically present face and body become a non-person, as if he had never existed. To the historian peering into the photograph, he becomes untrackable, unresearchable, a cipher. The violence that Gardner depicts in this photograph is not so much violence to the body. The violence this photograph enacts is the violence of cutting that invisible cord which connects the material body to the immaterial name. The resulting paradoxes of presence and absence are what make this image so powerful. We might even say haunting. Clark's identity hangs there on the very fragile support of a little piece of cracker box that is precariously anchored in a pile of dirt. For the Confederate soldier, that tenuous connection has already been cut, and he looms before us as a paradox, a fully present non-person, a true ghost. And so I'm finally going to get off the photograph now and move to some monuments in the time that remains. I want to explore this paradox a bit further by looking at it from a different angle, from outside the frame of the photograph, from the point of view of those who had the name but could no longer match it to the body. And to do this, I will pivot away from Alexander Gardner and Antietam and shift instead to Gettysburg and to a family in western Pennsylvania, in rural Washington County. And this is the area in which they lived, as it appears today. A family named Sprowls. The father, William Sprowls, was the son of Irish immigrants and had become a very successful sheep farmer, owned a beautiful little farm, just like this one, a little over an hour's drive from where we are sitting today. He had several sons, two of whom enlisted in August 1862 in the Pennsylvania 140th Regiment, Company K. These two sons were named George and Jesse Sproulls. Jesse Sproulls died at Gettysburg less than a year later on July 2nd or July 3rd, and his body was not recovered. The same fate happened to thousands at Gettysburg, but it is notable in this case because his brother George was with him and would have done everything he could to find the body and put it in a marked grave. The fact that Jesse's body was lost shows just how difficult it was to keep body and name joined together. George's story is even more heart-wrenching. He survived Gettysburg, left his dead brother on the field, and then stayed with the regiment through many more battles until the terrible Battle of Spotsylvania, Virginia in May 1864, again, one of the most horrific of the Civil War, where he was wounded and captured. Of course, the family didn't know this at the time. His name first appeared like this in the local newspaper on June 1st as missing. He's down here at the bottom, right down there in the last line, G. Sproulls. That is likely the first news his family received. It was terrible news, but not necessarily the end. Some soldiers got temporarily separated from their regiments. Sometimes they had deserted. Sometimes the information was simply wrong. From that point onward, George's story becomes very murky. He seems to have been sent to a Confederate hospital, and from there to the notorious prisoner of war camp at Andersonville, Georgia, although his name doesn't appear on any records there. He may have died there, as so many Union soldiers did, except that a man from Washington County later reported seeing him in Virginia on his way home. Like many other families of the missing, the Sproulls family waited for him for some years, but he never arrived. Eventually, they had to accept that their missing son had become, like so many others, one of the unknown dead. So why have I chosen the Sproulls family? You can go to the next. Because of an extraordinary monument they erected in their church cemetery, as extraordinary in its own way, I think, as Gardner's photograph. This monument looks in every way like a tomb, but it is not a tomb. It is a cenotaph, which is literally an empty tomb, a funerary marker without a body. The cenotaph was a surrogate tomb, a response to the crisis I have been discussing, the cutting of the body from its name. From what I can tell, soldier cenotaphs were a far more common response to this problem of the unknown dead than scholars have realized. And we don't have good data on this, but just impressionistically, I'm finding more and more cenotaphs everywhere I look. The Sproulls cenotaph is located, next one, in a remote hillside cemetery, extremely beautiful, actually, now on private farmland, since the church and congregation that were once attached to it are now long gone. And believe me, this was very difficult for me to find. It's a familiar tomb form, the cenotaph, an obelisk in granite, somewhat larger than its neighboring gravestones. But what makes it stand out is not so much its size as an amazing set of inscriptions which clearly taxed the stone carver to his limit. And I passed out to you, and you can, those of you can look at and take that home with you. Judging by his very idiosyncratic word and line breaks, this stone carver had obviously never dealt with such a long and complex text. Only by reading these inscriptions do we realize that it is not a tomb. You can go to the next. And so I don't really have time to go through all of the inscriptions. I'm going to spend a little more time with the last one, but they go into considerable detail on the history of their sons and their military record, beginning with rallying promptly at their country's call in the dark hour of rebellion to meet the armed hordes of treason. And this may sound like very florid language to you, but this was the way that most Union families really did consider the Confederate cause as treason, treason to the nation. So they were, in this case, very conventionally and loyal Union families. And you can go to the next one. That's Jesse Sproul's. This is George Sproul's going through his history and their inability to find out what happened to him after he was taken prisoner, after he was sent to Andersonville, that prison of untold horror and suffering, and here all further knowledge of his fate ends. And then final inscription, which is really, in a way, the most amazing one of all. And what this inscription struggles to express is not just grief about the death of their son, and not just grief about the disappearance of his body, but it's really about the veil of mystery that still hangs over him. That veil of mystery is the term, is the phrase they use there. It's about the pain of not knowing where he died, or how he died, or even at what age he died. So they don't even know the year he died. One of the most interesting things about this inscription is that it is an epitaph about their failure to write a proper epitaph for him. It's a kind of meta-epitaph in a way, right? So, in the absence of a true epitaph, he becomes, quote, another of those many victims for whose return loving eyes have so often watched in vain, unquote. The word victim is very striking because it doesn't appear in more public discourse in the time. We're very used to talking about victims now, but this was not the way soldiers were talked about in the 19th century. The word victim doesn't appear, for example, in Beecher's sermon, which is all about the dead as agents, not victims. And I haven't seen the word victim on a single Civil War monument put up by a town or other corporate body. And I have looked. So even though the cenotaph's language is deeply saturated with Christianity and with nationalism, it is ultimately about what those systems cannot supply and cannot solve. The inscriptions circulate the two brothers back to the loving eyes of home, even as they await, quote, that bright world where battle thunders never roll and sorrows never come, unquote. So why did the family erect this cenotaph in the first place? Their local congregation obviously already knew these two brothers and knew their story, so it's not as if they had to publicize the story to them. As compelling as the text is, the cenotaph is clearly more than its text and more than a mere symbol. Here we go on to the next slide. Even though it lacks the physical presence of the two bodies, the cenotaph has its own material presence, inhabiting a place that was significant in the lives of the dead, on ground the two young men must have crossed many times themselves. The names laboriously carved into its stone shaft have their own strange power. My own encounter with these names on this particular hillside was completely different from my first encounter with the names in a book digitized by Google, which may seem like a very obvious point, but it is all too often neglected by visual studies, which tends to forget that visual experience is just part of our embodied relations to the world of objects. So to the students of the visual, I would like to remind them that, quote, alas, we are in the body, unquote. What I am suggesting rather tentatively is that the cenotaph became an enchanted object in its own right. And I think it was because of its extraordinary effort to overcome the absence of the dead bodies, to close the acknowledged gap here between the name and the body, between the living and the dead. I know that my own response to the cenotaph was shaped not only by the stories of the two deceased, but by the anguished traces of the parents and family and congregation who conceived it and surely visited it and shed their tears near it. And I felt surrounded by their ghosts as much as by the ghosts of the men the cenotaph commemorated. I say this not to dismiss the psychologists, not to dismiss the science of grief, which talks about externalization and closure and so on, but to suggest that there is a place to think about cenotaphs and other objects of death as having an agency of their own beyond what we can control or perhaps even understand. I want to put the cenotaph, and here's where I'm going to wrap up. I want to put the cenotaph in a different light by talking briefly about one final circulation of these two brothers' names. Both their names appeared, here we can go to the next slide, on a gigantic monument erected on the battlefield of Gettysburg in 1910, the Pennsylvania State Memorial. One more click, right there, you can see it in the distance. And then again, here it is, towering over the battlefield. The Pennsylvania Monument took on the immense task of documenting all of the Pennsylvania regiments that were at Gettysburg and casting every soldier's name, over 34,000 of them, in bronze tablets that ring the base of the monument, whether they died there or not. Can we go to the next slide? Of course, many who did survive the battle, who are listed here, died later in the war somewhere else, George Sproul's being a case in point. The names are organized by regiment and company just as they would have been on a muster roll. And then go to the next slide. George and Jesse appear at the bottom of the 140th Regiment panel, which you see here. So, and one more click, and one more. There they are. So this is the very lower right of that 140th Regiment panel. There's a star by Jesse's name because he died in the battle. Names began to appear on public Civil War monuments in towns and cemeteries as early as the late 1860s, initially names of the dead only. The practice of naming the dead on war memorials had started before the Civil War, but very sporadically, and then took off after the Civil War, a response, I believe, to the widespread disappearance of the bodies. These local memorials fulfilled some of the same functions as the family cenotaph, but recirculated the names in a new direction, attaching them to the corporate body of the town and by extension the body of the nation. In other words, they began to do the rhetorical work that Beecher had already anticipated in his 1863 sermon. It is interesting that these naming practices after the Civil War have never been properly appreciated or studied. And most scholars still have the misconception that naming on memorials began seriously only after World War I. It's obviously not true. By the late 19th century, Civil War memorials began to include names of surviving veterans as well as the dead, as they do here at the Pennsylvania Memorial. And actually, this is an amazing picture that I took off of a digitized version of this book at the dedication of the memorial, which actually shows a Union veteran. He's touching his own name on the plaque. I suspect that one reason the Pennsylvania Memorial organizers decided to do so was to produce as many names as possible. It's one measure of how much we have neglected this issue that no one seems to have realized that the Pennsylvania Memorial must have been the largest collection of names on a monument anywhere on the planet. And if you, I've just put together, we have a little spreadsheet here that is, it's obviously incomplete, but it shows you where the Pennsylvania State Memorial sort of fits into this development. Obviously, it was overtopped after World War II in the huge cemeteries in Europe. But up until this time, it must have been by far, and it's also interesting that the Allegheny County Soldiers and Sailors is the only other one that even comes close. So right here in Pennsylvania, we have these two immense collections of names on a monument. So what to make of the appearance of the Sproul's names on this grandiose edifice? And I think we can go one more, we'll get back to it, yeah. The memorial is actually a brilliant design. The bronze tablets are scaled to the human body, but the visitor's experience actually transcends them. After standing on the ground and looking at the names, you walk up that staircase there to a platform where the names are now behind you and below you. So once you get up to the platform, you no longer see the names. 8 statues of commanders are above you, and it's actually Lincoln and the governor, and then 6 military commanders from Pennsylvania. Then you walk up another staircase, it's unfortunately now closed, but you walk up another staircase to another platform just below the female allegory of victory at the top, where you are above both the names and the commanders, and you cast your imperial eye over the prospect of the battlefield. The movement is away from the ground, in other words, away from the body. The names are here because the bodies were once here, but paradoxically we lose that connection of name to body, and instead we get an almost disembodied experience of state and national triumph. Unlike Lieutenant Clark, who settled into obscurity in his family cemetery plot, the Sproul's brothers circulated restlessly in life and death, their names ending up back in Gettysburg in a veritable army of names. Henry Ward Beecher's prediction, "He was your son, now he is the nation's," seems to have achieved its realization here in spatial form. Thanks.